One of the greatest strengths you can develop is becoming comfortable with your own company. In fact, learning to genuinely enjoy those quiet moments by yourself can completely transform the way you experience loneliness. There's something strangely refreshing about stepping away from the constant noise, the endless distractions, the difficult personalities, the vanity, and all the unnecessary chaos that surrounds us every day. Personally, I enjoy being alone from time to time. I enjoy sitting quietly in a warm bath with a good book. Sometimes it's simply watching a movie by myself without needing anyone else's company. Once you discover how to enjoy those moments, loneliness begins to lose much of its power over you. People often ask how to deal with loneliness, and the truth is that it's one of the most universal human experiences. Every single person encounters it at some point. I certainly did, especially when I was younger, throughout my 20s. I remember being in Rome roughly 20 years ago. I walked into a busy restaurant to have dinner alone. The waiter noticed that I wasn't with anyone and asked whether I was by myself. I answered, almost feeling embarrassed, "Yes, I'm alone." He smiled and replied in Italian, "Meglio solo che male accompagnato." That phrase stayed with me for years. Its meaning was simple but profound. It's far better to be alone than surrounded by the wrong people. There's an important lesson hidden inside those words. You have to learn to appreciate your own company. Being around others isn't always beneficial. Some people drain your energy, create unnecessary suffering, and leave emotional scars. We often convince ourselves that being with anyone is automatically better than being alone, but that isn't always true. Of course, solitude can hurt. Human beings are naturally social creatures, so it's perfectly normal to crave connection. But there are moments when being away from toxic, exhausting individuals is actually healthier. Instead of filling your life with people who bring negativity, you can fill it with things that genuinely enrich you. Read books, watch meaningful films, explore ideas. When I read an incredible book, I don't feel isolated. In many ways, I'm sharing time with another mind, another spirit, another perspective. I'm engaging in a conversation that stretches across time. I'm not suggesting this is a complete solution, but learning to enjoy your own company is one of life's most valuable abilities because sooner or later, everyone experiences periods of solitude. You need to become interested in your own thoughts. Your ideas should be worth exploring. Find books that challenge you. Pursue activities that genuinely excite you. When your inner world is alive, you're never truly alone. Whenever I become deeply absorbed in a remarkable book, loneliness fades into the background. Yes, sharing those experiences with someone else would be wonderful, but until then, these moments nourish the mind and soften the sting of isolation. Another important realization is this: you're not the only person experiencing loneliness. We often imagine that we're uniquely isolated, but that's simply not true. In today's world, loneliness has become almost an epidemic. Entire books have been written about it. Society has become increasingly disconnected. People spend more time online than face to face, and our relationships have become increasingly virtual. So remember this: you're not alone in feeling lonely. Millions of others are experiencing exactly the same thing. The next step is learning how to overcome it. That requires becoming more socially engaged. You have to place yourself back into the real world instead of living entirely behind screens. Loneliness builds momentum. I know this from personal experience. As a writer, I spend enormous amounts of time alone. And the longer you're isolated, the easier it becomes to stay isolated. You grow more hesitant around people. Social situations begin to feel uncomfortable. Conversations become awkward. It's almost as though you've forgotten how to connect. That's why you can't always trust your instincts when they tell you to stay home or avoid that gathering. Sometimes you have to deliberately move in the opposite direction. You have to build positive momentum. The more often you interact with people, the easier it becomes. The more conversations you have, the more opportunities you'll create to meet individuals who genuinely share your interests. If the internet helps you find people with similar passions, that's wonderful. But don't stop there. Turn those digital connections into real ones. Attend events, join communities, go where like-minded people gather, give yourself the chance to meet them in person. At the same time, never forget the most important lesson learned: to appreciate being alone. Find genuine satisfaction in those peaceful moments without the constant noise, the endless drama, the narcissism, and the distractions that consume modern life. Sometimes I truly enjoy my own company. I enjoy reading quietly. I enjoy watching a film without interruption. And once you're capable of finding happiness in those simple moments, loneliness begins to lose its grip on you. One more thing you need to understand is that social ability works like a muscle. It grows stronger only when you use it. Loneliness itself isn't necessarily harmful. What often makes it painful is the stigma attached to it. Society has convinced us that being lonely is something embarrassing, that being alone somehow means something is wrong with you. Because of that belief, many people carry shame simply for spending time by themselves. But the truth is almost the opposite. Being alone is one of the most important experiences you can have. It's during those quiet moments that you begin to understand yourself. It's when you confront your own thoughts, discover what truly matters to you, and learn to embrace the qualities that make you different from everyone else. None of that is possible if you're constantly surrounded by people or if you're afraid of solitude. Learning how to enjoy your own company isn't a weakness, it's a strength. In many ways, it's one of the foundations of success. So don't automatically label loneliness as something entirely negative. Instead, see it as an opportunity to develop a deeper relationship with yourself. At the same time, don't confuse healthy solitude with permanent isolation. Just as you force yourself to exercise if you want stronger muscles, you also have to push yourself socially. Real confidence doesn't appear overnight. It develops through repeated interaction with other people. That means putting your phone down more often. Instead of replacing real life experiences with virtual ones, go outside, talk to people, have conversations face to face. If you commit to doing that consistently, even something as simple as 10 meaningful social experiences each month, you'll notice a gradual transformation. Your confidence will grow, your ability to communicate will improve, your social instincts will become sharper. Just like physical training strengthens the body, regular interaction strengthens your social abilities. I remember another conversation where someone brought up one of the laws from the 48 Laws of Power. They mentioned Law 8TT. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. That's an important distinction. Solitude and isolation are not the same thing. Choosing to spend time alone can be healthy. Living in complete isolation is something entirely different. When you isolate yourself, you cut yourself off from valuable information, meaningful relationships, opportunities, and allies who could change your life. And the key difference lies in your emotional state. Loneliness carries emotional pain. It creates the feeling that you're disconnected from others, that nobody truly understands or values you. Since we're social beings, those feelings naturally hurt. Being alone, however, can feel completely different. Sometimes I genuinely enjoy it. I think to myself, I don't have to deal with unpleasant people today. I don't have to listen to foolish conversations. I can simply read, think, write, and enjoy my own space. In those moments, solitude feels liberating. It allows me to be exactly who I am without needing anyone's approval. Of course, I wouldn't want to live that way all the time. That would become unhealthy. But occasionally, it's incredibly refreshing. I remember sitting on an airplane once when I noticed a young woman traveling alone. She seemed deeply uncomfortable with the idea of being by herself. The moment the plane allowed internet access, she immediately reached for her phone. She started checking messages, sending texts, scrolling through social media, doing anything possible to avoid even a few minutes alone with her own thoughts. Watching her, I sensed something almost desperate. It wasn't simply boredom. It was as though silence itself frightened her. The idea of being alone felt unbearable. To me, that's a dangerous place to be. Human beings absolutely need connection. We thrive through relationships, conversation, and shared experiences. But if you're incapable of spending time alone, you'll never truly discover who you are. You'll never hear your own inner voice because it's constantly being drowned out by everyone else's. Life requires balance. You need meaningful relationships, but you also need moments of solitude. Only then can you understand what makes you unique. Only then can you recognize your own strengths instead of constantly defining yourself through other people's opinions. Someone once asked me about one of the darkest periods of my life. They reminded me that I had openly spoken about struggling with suicidal thoughts when I was younger and asked what ultimately pulled me out of that darkness. The answer wasn't simple. One reason was that I had someone who genuinely cared about me, a girlfriend who showed incredible patience and understanding. Because of her, I wasn't completely alone, but there was something else. There was a quiet voice inside me. It kept whispering the same message over and over. You have something valuable inside you. I've always been different. Even when I was in school, I never quite fit in. There was always something unusual about the way I thought. At times, that difference made me feel isolated. It made relationships harder. It often left me questioning where I belonged. Yet that same inner voice kept reminding me that being different wasn't necessarily a flaw. It told me that I had the ability to write, that someday, if I refused to quit, those abilities would eventually matter. So I kept going. I kept trying. I refused to give up. Eventually, when I was around 35 or 36 years old, I found myself in Italy during what was probably the lowest period of my life. Everything felt uncertain. I had reached a point where I questioned the direction of my future and wondered whether anything meaningful would ever come from all the struggles I had endured. Then something completely unexpected happened. I met a man named Juice Elfers, a book packager. During our conversation, he casually asked me a question that would end up changing my entire life. Do you have an idea for a book? The moment he asked that, something shifted inside me. For the first time in years, I could suddenly see a path forward. I thought to myself, yes, I actually do. Almost instinctively, I began describing an idea that would eventually become the 48 Laws of Power. As I explained it, he became more and more enthusiastic. By the time I finished, he looked at me and said, I'll pay you to write the proposal. If we can sell it, I'll support you while you finish the book. It felt as though my entire world had transformed in an instant. One moment I was surrounded by darkness. The next, I had purpose. Looking back, I realized that every terrible boss I'd ever worked for, every manipulative colleague, Every political workplace, every frustrating experience suddenly became valuable. Those experiences were no longer meaningless suffering. They had become material. All of those difficult personalities, all of those toxic workplaces, every disappointment, every betrayal, they all had a place. They all belonged inside that book. Suddenly, the pain I had carried for years wasn't wasted anymore. It had meaning. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone's breakthrough will happen exactly like mine. Life unfolds differently for every person, but I can honestly say that before that opportunity appeared, I was dangerously close to rock bottom. I've even asked my wife from time to time what she thinks might have happened if I had never met Juice that day. Would I have continued drifting from one meaningless job to another? Would depression have consumed me completely? Would I have turned to alcohol? Would I have destroyed my health? Would I even still be alive? I honestly don't know. Maybe I would have eventually found another purpose somewhere else. Maybe not. What I do know is that I was living through one of the darkest chapters of my life. And then everything changed because I finally found a reason to move forward. Purpose has that kind of power. It can pull someone out of complete darkness. It can switch the lights back on when everything feels hopeless. The difficult part is that purpose rarely announces itself. Most people spend years searching for it. Many become frustrated because they believe they should already know what they're meant to do. But purpose usually doesn't arrive while you're sitting alone in your room trying to force yourself to discover it. It often appears while you're living, while you're working, while you're meeting people, while you're exploring the world. Opportunities have a strange way of arriving unexpectedly. The important thing is to be prepared when they do. Someone might hear that story and think, well, you were just lucky. Something like that could never happen to me. I don't believe that's true. Opportunities exist around us far more often than we realize. The problem isn't always that they aren't there. The problem is that we're not ready to recognize them. Sometimes the person who could completely change your future crosses your path, but because you're discouraged, distracted, or convinced that you don't deserve success, you never notice them. Opportunity is rarely absent. Awareness is. It's happening every day. It's happening all around you. I remember reading about psychological experiments that perfectly illustrate this idea. There was one study involving two groups of people, one generally optimistic, the other more pessimistic. Each participant received a newspaper. They were told that somewhere inside was a voucher worth $100 and that they should return once they found it. What happened was fascinating. Many of the pessimistic participants searched page after page without ever finding it. Meanwhile, the optimistic participants noticed something immediately. Printed clearly across the front page was a message that read, "Stop reading. You've already won the 100 voucher. Go directly to the researchers." The answer had been right in front of them the entire time, yet many people completely overlooked it. Darren Brown demonstrated something similar in one of his experiments. He placed money, or in another version, a winning scratch card, in plain sight on a busy street. Optimistic people noticed it almost instantly. Pessimistic people walked right past it without seeing a thing. That completely changed the way I think about opportunity. It made me realize that our mental state determines what we're capable of noticing. Some people constantly see possibilities. Others see only obstacles. The tragedy is that those who miss opportunities often convince themselves that they're simply unlucky. They tell themselves that life never gives them a chance. In reality, they played a major role in creating that outcome. Your psychology shapes what you notice, and what you notice shapes your future. Robert often explains this through the idea that your attitude creates your circumstances. He describes two completely different ways of moving through life. One is narrow, defensive, and closed. The other is open, expansive, and receptive. You might simply call them pessimism and optimism. A closed mindset constantly searches for proof that life is unfair. It notices rejection, failure, hostility. It interprets every event through a negative filter. Eventually, that person begins creating exactly the reality they expect. The opposite mindset works differently. It believes that opportunities exist, that tomorrow could be better, that something meaningful might happen at any moment. This perspective isn't perfect reality either, but because it encourages action, curiosity, and openness, it ends up creating far better circumstances. The smallest opportunity becomes something worth pursuing. And over time, those small opportunities accumulate into an entirely different life. In many ways, your attitude becomes the architect of your future. Positive expectations don't magically guarantee success, but they dramatically increase the likelihood that you'll recognize and act upon the opportunities that are already surrounding you. The conversation then shifted toward another issue that affects millions of people today: pornography. If you spend enough time on social media, you'll eventually come across explicit content, whether you were looking for it or not. On some platforms, it appears right in front of you without any intention on your part. You could simply be scrolling through your feed, focused on something completely unrelated, and suddenly you're confronted with highly sexualized images. That raises an important question. What effect does constant exposure to pornography have on our ability to build real relationships? Research suggests that a large percentage of men and a significant number of women consume pornography regularly. The concern isn't simply about morality. It's about what repeated exposure does to the human mind. Does it replace the motivation to pursue genuine intimacy? Does it weaken the desire to build authentic romantic relationships? My view is that pornography functions very much like an addiction. The first thing people need to understand is that they're being manipulated. These platforms know exactly which images will capture your attention. They've studied human psychology. They understand what keeps people clicking, what keeps them returning, what keeps them craving more. You're not simply making random choices. You're being programmed. In many ways, you're being played. It's no different from the algorithms used by social media companies. Just as platforms carefully design endless feeds to keep your attention, the pornography industry has mastered the science of creating constant desire. Everything is engineered to keep you consuming, to keep you chasing the next image, the next video, the next stimulus. It's remarkably similar to fast food. Food companies spend enormous amounts of time studying flavors that make you want another bite. Pornography does something similar psychologically. It keeps feeding desire without ever allowing satisfaction. Now, I'm not approaching this from a moral or religious perspective. I'm not interested in preaching. What interests me is something much deeper. I've been writing about what I call love in its highest form. Not love directed toward an abstract idea, not love directed toward God, but love shared between two human beings. Whether it's between a man and a woman, two men, two women, it doesn't matter. The experience itself is extraordinary. Why? Because genuine love softens the boundaries between two individuals. Your ego begins to relax. You become capable of seeing the world through another person's eyes. Their happiness begins to matter to you. Their pain affects you. Your lives slowly become intertwined. For a social species like ours, that may be one of the highest forms of connection we can experience. It goes far beyond physical attraction. People often say they're falling in love. I think that phrase is remarkably accurate because falling requires vulnerability. You let go. You surrender a certain amount of control. You become emotionally exposed. That's frightening. Most people resist that process because they don't want to be hurt. They fear rejection. They fear disappointment. They fear betrayal. So the moment conflict appears, the moment someone criticizes the relationship, the moment a disagreement happens, they stop falling. They close themselves off. The relationship never reaches its full depth. But if two people continue opening themselves, despite those fears, if they remain vulnerable, if they keep trusting, something extraordinary can happen. A connection forms that transforms both people. That's one of the most meaningful human experiences available to us. Pornography moves us in the opposite direction. Instead of deepening intimacy, it reduces human beings to objects. Instead of mystery, it offers mechanics. Instead of connection, it offers consumption. Real love contains enchantment. There's an electricity between two people. Yes, sexuality is part of it, but sexuality isn't the entire experience. There's emotional intimacy, psychological intimacy, sometimes even something that feels spiritual. The entire world seems brighter when you're deeply in love. Everything becomes more vivid, more meaningful. Pornography strips away all of that. It removes the humanity. It turns something profoundly emotional into something mechanical. The people involved stop feeling like real human beings. They become little more than moving body parts. The romance disappears. The vulnerability disappears. The emotional tension disappears. Everything becomes flat, cold, transactional. Whenever I see it, I don't feel inspired. I feel sad, not only for the people consuming it, but often for the people trapped inside that industry as well. There's something deeply alienating about it. Again, I'm not someone who's opposed to sexuality. Quite the opposite. A beautifully made film with a genuine love story can be incredibly moving. I recently watched an old Japanese film directed by Yasujiro Ozu. There was a married man slowly becoming attracted to another woman. Almost nothing explicit happened. There were no graphic scenes, no nudity, no sexual spectacle, yet every glance, every conversation, every moment of hesitation built emotional intensity. When they finally shared a kiss, it carried enormous emotional weight. I found it deeply exciting, not because of physical exposure, but because of everything that led up to it. The longing, the restraint, the emotional tension, that's what made it powerful. Romance gave sexuality meaning. Emotion amplified desire. Without that emotional dimension, physical intimacy loses much of what makes it uniquely human. My concern is that many young people may never experience that kind of connection. Everything risks becoming increasingly mechanical, increasingly digital, increasingly artificial. We already talk about AI relationships, virtual companions, artificial intimacy. If we continue moving in that direction, we risk losing something essential. We risk losing our ability to genuinely fall in love, to surrender ourselves emotionally, to experience another human being in all their complexity. Even if that relationship lasts only a few months, it enriches your life. It expands who you are. It makes you more fully human. And that is something no screen can ever replace. The discussion then moved toward dopamine and how it influences motivation. Several psychologists have spoken about fascinating experiments involving rats. In one well-known study, researchers interfered with the part of the rat's brain responsible for dopamine production. Afterward, and they placed food directly in front of the animal. What happened was remarkable. If the food was placed right next to the rat's mouth, it would eat. But if it was only a short distance away, just far enough that the rat needed to make an effort, it simply wouldn't move. It would eventually starve despite having food within reach. The problem wasn't hunger. The problem was motivation. Dopamine isn't simply the chemical that makes us feel pleasure. It's the chemical that drives action. It pushes us to pursue goals, to get up, to move, to chase something meaningful. That raises an important concern. What happens when we're constantly stimulating our dopamine system through effortless rewards? Whether it's pornography, social media, and endless scrolling, or any other activity that delivers immediate gratification, are we gradually weakening our motivation to pursue things that require real effort? Research increasingly points in that direction. Continuous exposure to extremely stimulating activities appears capable of desensitizing dopamine receptors. Over time, the brain becomes less responsive. As a result, everyday activities feel less rewarding. Motivation begins to decline. Suddenly, reading a book feels difficult. Building a business feels exhausting. Learning a skill seems overwhelming. Real relationships demand too much effort. The easy reward becomes more attractive than the meaningful one. When you look at modern society, it's difficult not to notice certain patterns. Many people report feeling increasingly purposeless. Many young adults are entering fewer romantic relationships. Many are becoming more isolated than previous generations. It's reasonable to ask whether these trends are connected. If obtaining pleasure requires almost no effort, why would someone willingly choose the far more demanding path of developing themselves or pursuing genuine relationships? Of course, pornography isn't the only factor. Social media operates on many of the same psychological principles. The larger issue is that we're slowly forgetting what it means to be fully human. First and foremost, we're physical creatures. We don't exist only inside our minds. Our thinking isn't separate from our bodies, our hormones, our nervous system, our emotions. All of these influence how we perceive the world. And beyond being physical creatures, we're profoundly social ones. Human beings evolved through cooperation. Our greatest strength has always been our ability to understand one another. We observe facial expressions. We hear tone of voice. We recognize subtle emotional signals. We exchange ideas. We challenge one another. Through those interactions, our understanding grows. That is part of what makes us uniquely human. You're not simply a machine processing information. You're not an algorithm. You're not just another collection of data points waiting to be analyzed. You're a living person with emotions, instincts, physical needs, fears, ambitions, and relationships. That means your life must also be lived physically. You need to build things, create things, exercise, work, meet people, experience discomfort, develop skills with your own hands, engage directly with reality. Pornography pulls you away from that experience. It disconnects you from your body in a meaningful sense. Yes, there's physical stimulation, but that's very different from genuine embodiment. You're not participating in real human connection. You're consuming an artificial substitute. My hope is that eventually people will begin rejecting this lifestyle. I still believe the human spirit is remarkably resilient. Deep down, people know when something doesn't feel natural. They know when something leaves them emptier than before. Perhaps 20 or 30 years from now, we'll witness a cultural shift, a movement back toward authentic human experience, back toward community nature, conversation, real relationships, real purpose. In some ways, we're already seeing signs of it. I recently read about groups of university students who deliberately refuse to use social media. Membership in their community requires staying away from constant phone use. They don't want conversations interrupted by endless notifications. They don't want every experience filtered through a screen. When I heard about that, I found it incredibly encouraging. If I were their age today, I would probably want to join them. That doesn't mean technology itself is evil. I own a phone. I use technology every day. The issue isn't the tool. It's whether the tool begins controlling the person using it. I hope more people start asking themselves a simple question. What does it actually mean to live like a human being? Perhaps that question becomes the beginning of something much larger, a return to genuine connection, a return to physical experience, a return to curiosity, craftsmanship, community, and purpose. From there, the conversation turned toward another fascinating question. What truths about human nature are people most unwilling to accept? The first answer is surprisingly simple. Most of us don't like acknowledging where we came from. We prefer imagining ourselves as completely rational, civilized beings. Yet before language existed, before cities, before culture, we lived exactly as every other animal did. That reality makes many people uncomfortable. I remember visiting Sydney, Australia, more than a decade ago. Although I'm generally not a fan of zoos because I dislike seeing animals confined, I visited one that had an extraordinary chimpanzee enclosure. The space allowed the animals to move freely, behaving much as they would in nature. I ended up watching them for nearly 2 hours. What fascinated me wasn't simply the animals themselves. It was how familiar they seemed. There was clearly an alpha male. Other males organized themselves around him. Competition, status, alliances, social politics. It felt strangely similar to observing a corporate office. Watching them reminded me of executives competing inside a large company. Then I noticed something interesting about the visitors. Many laughed nervously. Some looked uncomfortable. Others giggled almost as though they were embarrassed. It wasn't because the chimpanzees were behaving strangely. It was because people recognized something unsettling. They were looking at themselves. They were seeing human behavior reflected back through another species. That realization makes many people deeply uncomfortable. We don't like remembering that beneath all our sophistication, part of us is still profoundly animal. And that's a truth most people spend their entire lives trying not to face. There's another truth about human nature that people resist accepting. We like to imagine ourselves as rational, generous, and morally consistent. We want to believe that our decisions are guided by logic and fairness, that we're fundamentally different from those who manipulate, compete, or act out of selfish motives. But that's a comforting illusion. Human beings are far less rational than we like to admit. We all carry contradictions. We all have moments driven by emotion rather than reason. We all experience envy, insecurity, aggression, and selfishness. The difference is that most people prefer to believe those traits belong to everyone else. Take narcissism, for example. The word has become incredibly popular. It's used to describe politicians, celebrities, bosses, former partners, almost anyone we dislike. But very few people ever stop to ask themselves a more uncomfortable question. Could I be narcissistic too? The answer is yes. Every human being possesses narcissistic tendencies to some degree. That's simply part of our nature. Think about it. Imagine you're reading a book and suddenly you come across your own birthday printed on a random page. Immediately your attention locks onto it. Or perhaps someone mentions your hometown, your profession, or even your zodiac sign. Without realizing it, your interest suddenly increases. Why? Because it relates to you. Our minds are naturally drawn toward ourselves. That's not a moral failure. It's simply how human psychology works. If you're standing in a crowded room and someone quietly mentions your name across the room, your ears instantly notice it. You weren't trying to listen. Your attention simply shifted automatically. We're all wired this way. The problem begins when we refuse to acknowledge it. Instead, we convince ourselves that narcissism belongs exclusively to politicians, billionaires, celebrities, or difficult people we've encountered in life. It's Donald Trump. It's Elon Musk. It's my boss. It's my ex. Everyone else is the narcissist, never us. But self-awareness begins the moment you're willing to recognize those same tendencies within yourself. That doesn't mean you're hopeless. It doesn't mean you're destined to become manipulative or self-absorbed. It simply means you're honest enough to see reality. And without that honesty, change becomes impossible. It's similar to what happens in addiction recovery. One of the very first steps is admitting there's a problem. If someone refuses to acknowledge their addiction, nothing improves. Denial guarantees stagnation. The same principle applies to personality. If you genuinely want to become less narcissistic, you first have to recognize the narcissism already living inside you. Otherwise, you'll spend your entire life blaming everyone else. Even history's greatest moral leaders weren't completely free from these tendencies. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. possessed extraordinary qualities, but they were still human beings. No one escapes human nature. There are no perfect saints walking this earth. The healthier approach is humility. Instead of pretending you're above these instincts, acknowledge them, observe them, learn from them. Only then can you begin directing those traits toward something productive. Healthy narcissism often appears in artists, entrepreneurs, inventors, and creators. These individuals possess enormous confidence in their own vision. Sometimes they're difficult personalities. Sometimes they're demanding. Sometimes they're obsessive, but rather than allowing that energy to become destructive, they channel it into creating something valuable for the world. Steve Jobs is a good example. By many accounts, he wasn't easy to work with. He could be controlling, demanding, relentless. Yet much of that intense self-belief became focused on building extraordinary products that changed entire industries. That's healthy narcissism. The energy remains, only its direction changes. The conversation then turned toward another important question. What should you do when you're dealing with a narcissist? The honest answer is, you're almost always dealing with one. Every workplace contains people driven by ego. Every social circle has individuals craving validation. Every organization contains personalities desperate for recognition. The real question isn't whether narcissists exist, it's how you respond to them. One of the most famous principles from the 48 Laws of Power immediately becomes relevant: never outshine the master. If your boss is deeply insecure, if your manager constantly needs to feel superior, if someone above you derives their identity from status, openly demonstrating that you're more talented than they are is usually a strategic mistake. That doesn't mean pretending to be incompetent. It means understanding psychology. People rarely resent those beneath them. They resent those who threaten their identity. If your success makes someone feel small, they may begin viewing you as an enemy rather than an asset. The mistake many ambitious people make is assuming talent alone determines success. It doesn't. Perception matters. Timing matters. Emotional intelligence matters. The truly skilled strategist knows how to shine without making insecure people feel overshadowed. At the same time, there's another danger. You must never confuse strategic restraint with genuine inferiority. Outwardly, you may choose humility. Internally, however, And you should never convince yourself that you're less capable. Those are two completely different things. Externally, you play the game wisely. Internally, you remain fully aware of your own value. You might think, this person currently has authority over me. For now, I'll learn everything I can. I'll stay patient. I'll avoid unnecessary conflict. But deep inside, you know your potential isn't defined by someone else's title. Someday the circumstances will change. Someday you'll outgrow that environment. And when that time comes, you'll no longer need their approval. That's the difference between strategy and insecurity. One protects your future. The other quietly destroys your confidence. Mastering power isn't about suppressing who you are. It's about understanding people well enough to know when to reveal your strengths and when to keep them hidden until the right moment arrives. People often ask me whether success requires becoming an actor. My answer usually surprises them. You already are one. Every human being is. The difference is that some people recognize it while others spend their lives pretending they don't. Think about a small child. Long before they understand psychology or strategy, they already know how to influence the people around them. A child cries because they know it brings attention. They behave differently depending on which parent they're speaking to. Sometimes they're charming. Sometimes they're stubborn. Sometimes they're perfectly behaved. Other times they're difficult. They're constantly experimenting with behavior to discover what gets results. They're learning one of the oldest skills in human history, adaptation. As adults, we continue doing exactly the same thing. We simply become more sophisticated. When you speak to your boss, you don't behave exactly the way you behave with your closest friend. When you're around your parents, you're a different version of yourself than when you're with your children. Your tone changes. Your body language changes. Your humor changes. Even the words you choose begin to shift. You're adapting to the situation. That's acting. We often imagine acting as something dishonest, but that's a misunderstanding. Human beings are social creatures. Language gives us the remarkable ability to present ourselves differently depending on context. We can soften the truth. We can hide frustration. We can compliment someone even when we don't fully agree. We can remain polite even when we're irritated. Imagine a world where everyone spoke every thought that entered their mind, every annoyance, every criticism, every negative judgment. Society would collapse almost immediately. Relationships wouldn't survive. Businesses wouldn't function. Friendships would disappear. Civilization depends on a certain amount of emotional restraint and social performance. That's why everyone acts. The problem isn't acting. The problem is refusing to admit that you already do it. Many people feel uncomfortable hearing this because they associate acting with manipulation or deception. But those aren't exactly the same thing. Being socially intelligent means understanding that every environment requires a different version of yourself. You're not lying. You're adjusting. You're reading the room. You're recognizing what the moment requires. One conversation naturally leads to another important principle from the 48 laws of power. Always say less than necessary. This is one of the most misunderstood laws in the entire book. People often think it's encouraging silence for its own sake. That's not the point. The principle is about self-control. Watch powerful people carefully. They rarely feel the need to fill every silence. They aren't constantly explaining themselves. They don't rush to express every opinion. They speak deliberately. And because they speak selectively, people naturally pay closer attention. Someone who talks endlessly creates a very different impression. The more words you use, the greater the chance of revealing insecurity. contradicting yourself, or saying something you'll later regret. Excessive talking often signals a lack of discipline. If someone can't control their speech, people unconsciously begin wondering what else they struggle to control. True influence often comes from restraint. Imagine sitting in a meeting where one person comments on every single topic. Before long, everyone stops listening. Their words lose value. Now imagine another person who remains quiet for most of the discussion. They observe. They listen carefully. Then, after several minutes, they calmly offer a single thoughtful insight. Immediately the room pays attention. Why? Because scarcity creates value. Their silence gave weight to their words. There's another psychological element at work. Silence creates mystery. People naturally become curious about those who reveal less. When someone constantly explains themselves, there's nothing left to wonder about. But when a person chooses their words carefully, others begin thinking, what are they really thinking? Why haven't they spoken yet? Uh, what do they see that I don't? That uncertainty creates presence. It creates influence. Many people struggle with this because they believe authenticity means saying whatever comes to mind. In reality, authenticity doesn't require impulsiveness. You can be genuine while still being disciplined. In professional life especially, self-control is often far more valuable than constant self-expression. Over the years, I noticed something similar while working with teams. Everyone develops what I call an invisible contribution score. Some individuals speak frequently, but because their ideas are often unprepared, repetitive, or poorly organized, people begin expecting low-quality contributions before they even open their mouths. Eventually, when they start talking, others quietly lose interest. Not because they're incapable, but because they've trained everyone around them to expect noise instead of value. Then there are the opposite personalities, people who speak rarely. When they finally do contribute, everyone instinctively listens. Their words carry weight because they've earned that reputation. Each contribution feels intentional. Each observation feels considered. That's not an accident. Influence compounds over time. Your reputation determines how people receive your ideas before you've even spoken. I remember watching this dynamic with highly successful individuals. Some would sit through entire meetings saying almost nothing. Everyone else filled the silence trying to impress them. Then, near the end, they'd offer one short observation. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. People leaned forward. They analyzed every sentence. Not because the words themselves were magical, but because the person speaking had learned the power of restraint. Power isn't always loud. Often, it's remarkably quiet. The people who constantly compete for attention usually possess the least. Those who no longer need attention often command the most. That's one of the great paradoxes of influence. Sometimes the less you say, the more everyone remembers it. Another law that often sparks strong reactions is this one: let others do the work, but take the credit. At first glance, people assume it's encouraging dishonesty or exploitation, but that isn't the deeper lesson. Like several of the laws in the 48 Laws of Power, there's an element of irony. The book isn't telling you to become unethical. It's showing you how power frequently operates in the real world, whether we like it or not. When I worked in Hollywood, I experienced this firsthand. At one point, I worked closely with a film director. We'd spend hours together discussing stories, refining scenes, improving dialogue, and developing characters. During those sessions, I constantly contributed ideas, entire conversations, pieces of dialogue, plot developments, character motivations. Many of those ideas eventually appeared in the screenplay. But when the credits rolled, only one name appeared: his. People would praise a brilliant scene or quote a memorable line, believing it came entirely from him. Often, those were my words. Yet my contribution remained invisible. At the time, I found it frustrating. I felt overlooked. I wondered why no one recognized the work I'd done behind the scenes. But eventually, I realized something important. This wasn't an exception. It was the way many industries function. Look around almost any successful organization. The person standing in front of the camera usually isn't the only one responsible for the final product. Behind every television host, every executive, every celebrity, every public figure, there are researchers, editors, writers, designers, strategists, producers. Entire teams contribute to what eventually becomes one person's achievement. Most of those people remain invisible. That's simply the reality of how influence is distributed. The mistake many young professionals make is becoming emotionally consumed by that reality. They become resentful. They constantly seek recognition. They feel personally insulted every time someone forgets to acknowledge their contribution. Ironically, that reaction often damages their reputation far more than the original oversight. Instead of appearing talented, they begin appearing insecure. Imagine someone who publicly complains every time their name is left off a project. Perhaps the omission wasn't intentional. Perhaps it was simply an oversight. But if they repeatedly demand recognition, people gradually begin associating them with ego rather than excellence. Over time, colleagues stop seeing their work. They start seeing their need for validation. That's a dangerous reputation to build. The wiser approach is patience. Focus on becoming so valuable that your work eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Recognition earned over time is far more powerful than recognition demanded in the moment. Of course, this doesn't mean allowing yourself to be exploited forever. Context matters. If you're still early in your career, constantly fighting for credit may cost you opportunities rather than create them. Sometimes the smartest strategy is to continue learning, continue producing outstanding work, and allow your abilities to compound quietly. Eventually, your own opportunities arrive. Eventually, your own projects appear. Eventually, your own name stands at the top. Until then, emotional discipline is often a greater asset than immediate recognition. Every law requires intelligence. There isn't a single rule that applies universally. Power always depends on context. What helps a leader may hurt an employee. What works for someone at the top could become disastrous for someone still building their career. That's why strategy always begins with understanding your position. The conversation naturally moved towards something even more fundamental. All of these principles, remaining patient, controlling your speech, avoiding unnecessary conflict, understanding power, depend upon one essential ability: emotional mastery. Without emotional control, none of these laws can be applied consistently. Imagine trying not to outshine an insecure superior while your pride demands immediate recognition. Imagine trying to stay silent when your emotions desperately want the final word. Imagine resisting revenge after someone insults you publicly. Without self-control, every strategy collapses. This doesn't mean suppressing your emotions entirely. That would be equally unhealthy. Emotion gives life its energy. It's what inspires creativity. It's what drives entrepreneurs to build companies. It's what motivates artists to create. It's what pushes people to pursue difficult dreams. The goal isn't becoming emotionless. The goal is learning how to direct emotion rather than allowing emotion to direct you. Certain emotional reactions repeatedly sabotage people. Anger, impulsiveness, jealousy, the desperate need to prove yourself, the craving for immediate recognition. These emotions don't simply influence behavior. They communicate something to everyone around you. People instinctively notice emotional instability. They begin questioning your judgment, your reliability, your leadership, your ability to perform under pressure. On the other hand, someone who remains composed during stressful situations creates an entirely different impression. Calmness signals confidence. Patience signals strength. Self-control communicates competence. That's why emotional regulation is such an important form of power, not because emotions are bad, but because uncontrolled emotions make you predictable. And predictable people are easy to manipulate. This becomes especially difficult when you're young. Youth naturally comes with intensity. Your emotions feel overwhelming. Everything seems urgent. Every victory feels enormous. Every setback feels catastrophic. Most people only learn emotional discipline after making painful mistakes. They lose opportunities, damage relationships, say things they later regret. They experience the consequences firsthand. Looking back, they realize that the problem wasn't their intelligence. It wasn't their talent. It was their inability to pause before reacting. That's one of the reasons experience becomes so valuable. Each mistake teaches a lesson that self-control could have prevented. The hope is that by understanding these principles early, you won't need to repeat every painful lesson yourself. You'll still make mistakes, everyone does, but perhaps you'll make fewer of them. And each one will teach you something that strengthens your judgment instead of weakening it. One of the greatest advantages you can develop in life is the ability to learn from your mistakes without allowing them to define you. Most people respond to failure in one of two ways. Some become consumed by it. They replay the experience over and over, criticizing themselves endlessly until they begin believing that one mistake represents who they are. Others go to the opposite extreme. They refuse to examine what happened at all. Nothing was ever their fault. Someone else is always responsible. Circumstances become the excuse. Luck becomes the explanation. Both reactions prevent growth. The wiser path lies somewhere in between. When something goes wrong, study it honestly. Ask yourself, what did I miss? What could I have handled differently? What lesson is hidden inside this experience? That kind of reflection is invaluable. Life has an extraordinary way of teaching us the same lesson repeatedly until we finally understand it. If you ignore the lesson the first time, it usually comes back, sometimes in a different form, sometimes through different people. But the underlying pattern remains remarkably similar. Until you recognize it, you keep living it. That's one reason self-awareness is so powerful. It allows you to interrupt destructive patterns before they become permanent habits. Another topic people frequently ask about is revenge. When someone betrays you, humiliates you, or deliberately tries to damage your reputation, the emotional impulse is immediate. You want them to suffer. You want justice. You want to prove they were wrong. That's an understandable reaction. It's deeply human. But acting while those emotions are burning is almost always a mistake. Anger narrows your vision. It pushes you toward decisions that feel satisfying in the moment, but become costly later. I've watched countless people destroy their own careers because they couldn't resist responding emotionally. Someone insults them, they explode. Someone criticizes them, they lash out publicly. Someone undermines them, they immediately declare war. For a brief moment, it feels empowering. But afterward, they're the ones dealing with the consequences. The person with greater emotional discipline usually wins. Not because they're passive, but because they choose the battlefield instead of reacting to someone else's. Sometimes the strongest response is no immediate response at all. Silence gives you time to think. Distance allows emotions to cool. clarity returns. Only then can you decide whether action is actually necessary. In many situations, you'll discover that what originally felt like a devastating insult wasn't worth your energy in the first place. That's another lesson people struggle to accept. Not every battle deserves to be fought. Some victories cost more than they're worth. Winning an argument while destroying an important relationship isn't much of a victory. Defeating a rival while damaging your own reputation may ultimately be a loss. Strategy requires perspective. You have to ask yourself not only, can I win, but also, what will winning actually cost me? Long-term thinkers ask different questions than impulsive people. They're willing to sacrifice immediate satisfaction for greater future rewards. This mindset becomes especially important in the workplace. Every office has politics. Every organization has alliances, competition, personal agendas. Some people wish that weren't true. They believe workplaces should operate purely on merit. Unfortunately, reality is more complicated. Human beings bring their emotions wherever they go. They bring ambition, jealousy, fear, pride, insecurity. No company is completely free from those dynamics. The mistake is pretending they don't exist. Once you understand that, you stop taking everything personally. You realize that someone else's behavior often says more about their own fears than about your abilities. An insecure manager may resist promoting talented employees because they fear becoming replaceable. A jealous colleague may spread rumors because your success reminds them of their own frustrations. Understanding these motivations doesn't mean approving of them. It simply helps you respond intelligently instead of emotionally. Rather than asking, why are they doing this to me? You begin asking, what insecurity or motivation is driving this behavior? That shift changes everything. And you stop reacting like a victim. You begin observing like a strategist. And once you start seeing human behavior clearly, you become far less likely to be manipulated by it. Ultimately, power isn't about controlling other people. It's about mastering yourself first. And because the person who controls their emotions controls their decisions. The person who controls their decisions gradually shapes their future. And over a lifetime, those small moments of discipline often create the biggest difference between an ordinary life and an extraordinary one. Another misconception people often have is that becoming powerful means becoming cold. People imagine that if you understand strategy, human nature, and influence, you'll eventually become manipulative or emotionally detached. I don't believe that's true. In fact, I think the opposite is true. The better you understand human beings, the more compassion you often develop for them. You begin recognizing that everyone is fighting battles you can't immediately see. The arrogant person may actually be deeply insecure. The aggressive person may be operating from fear. The person who constantly seeks attention may simply feel invisible inside. Understanding doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it gives you perspective, and perspective allows you to respond intelligently rather than emotionally. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming that every action is directed personally at them. Someone is rude. Someone ignores your message. Someone criticizes your work. Your first instinct is to think, what did I do wrong? Often the answer is very little. People are usually preoccupied with themselves. They're thinking about their own problems, their own ambitions, their own anxieties, their own frustrations. Once you understand that, you stop carrying unnecessary emotional weight. You realize that not everything requires a reaction. Sometimes people are simply projecting their internal struggles onto whoever happens to be standing nearby. That realization can be incredibly freeing. Another important lesson is patience. Modern culture encourages immediacy. We want quick success, quick wealth, quick recognition, quick transformation, but almost everything meaningful develops slowly. Mastery takes years. Strong relationships take years. Trust takes years. Reputation takes years. People often underestimate how much they can accomplish over a decade because they're obsessed with what can happen in the next 6 months. When I wrote the 48 Laws of Power, I wasn't expecting it to become what it eventually became. The book grew gradually, year after year. It continued finding new readers. Its influence expanded over time. Had I judged its success after only a few months, I would have completely misunderstood its future. Life works that way surprisingly often. The greatest rewards usually belong to those who remain consistent long after everyone else has become impatient. That's why persistence matters so much. Talent is valuable. Intelligence is valuable. But persistence frequently outperforms both. Many gifted people give up too early. They mistake temporary failure for permanent defeat. Meanwhile, someone with slightly less talent simply keeps going, year after year, improving little by little. Eventually, the difference becomes enormous. This applies to almost every area of life: business, writing, fitness, relationships, personal growth. Small improvements repeated consistently create extraordinary results. Most people don't fail because they're incapable. They fail because they stop before the results have time to appear. If there's one message I'd want younger people to remember, it's this: don't become discouraged by how far away your goals seem. Focus on the next step, then the one after that. Progress compounds. Just as money compounds through investment, character compounds through daily choices. Every disciplined decision strengthens the next one. Every act of courage makes future courage easier. Every difficult conversation prepares you for the next. You are constantly shaping the person you'll become, whether you realize it or not. In the end, life isn't determined by one dramatic moment. It's built through thousands of ordinary decisions made over many years. How you respond to setbacks, how you treat people, how well you control your emotions, how willing you are to keep learning. Those are the habits that quietly determine your future. Power isn't something that suddenly arrives one day. It's something you gradually build through awareness, discipline, patience, and a deep understanding of both yourself and the people around you. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. The greatest victory isn't mastering other people. It's mastering yourself.